Chris, what will you be doing on Tuesday, the 7th of March?
I don't know.
I'm not inviting you anywhere nice.
I would hazard a guess at news.
Yeah, you'll be doing news. I will be hovering on the website to get Eurovision tickets because they just announced today that that's when they're going to go on sale.
Oh, is that right?
And they also announced that there's loads of Eurovisions you can go to. So it's not just the final. There's the semi-finals and there's the jury final and some of the rehearsal and run-throughs as well. So actually there are lots of opportunities.
All in Liverpool?
In Liverpool to go and see Eurovision.
Is that where people are going to be on their computers hitting F5 or whatever it is, trying to refresh, give me a ticket?
Oh, they're talking about technology. Actually, a very good way of experiencing Eurovision is with our sister podcast, Eurovision Cast.
Neat plug.
Yeah, where they basically do what we did with Brexit, discuss it a lot in great detail while having an interesting time, but about Eurovision.
Nina Warhurst and chums. I've seen those things she's put on social media with her kind of league tables of entrance going back to 1992 or whatever.
She's hardcore, yeah. Right, let's see what else we can rustle up on this episode of this podcast, Newscast.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And in a bit, we will be joined by the children's author, Michael Rosen, because it is World Book Day when we're recording this episode. I hope you had some good costumes to hand. First of all, though, it's day 2 of what the Telegraph is calling the lockdown files, all those WhatsApp messages between Matt Hancock, the health secretary during the early stages of the COVID pandemic, and Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak and all their advisors and their pollsters and Dominic Cummings and Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty and basically everyone who had anything to do with COVID. Where do you think that story has kind of got to?
Well, it carries bubbling along, doesn't it? So it's not quite, I don't think, necessarily yet at the kind of the obvious comparison is with the Telegraph's expenses, MP's expenses revelations of the best part of 15 years ago. It's generating a lot of news. It's loads and loads of pickup in lots of different news organisations, but isn't necessarily kind of top story everywhere, every day for days and days and days on end. But they have got shed loads of stuff to reveal. I went into Telegraph Towers, the headquarters of the Telegraph, today. I was shown the bunker, which is how they kind of describe this kind of windowless room, where about 8 journalists since the turn of the year, so for 2 months, sitting in a room not much bigger than the Newscast studio, not much bigger than your kind of average maybe bedroom in a house, where they're all sitting behind desktop computers that are not on the internet. That's where the data is. They're then having to, when they look at a link that might have been shared in one of these WhatsApps, they're having to type it out longhand in order to fire it up on their laptop on the internet. Okay. That's the data security that's going on. And then they've been ploughing through it, all these different WhatsApp groups, then with all of these different strands of stories that are coming out.
And the journalist who's at the heart of that effort is Isabel Oakeshott, who's worked at a few newspapers, but she's working with the Telegraph on this. And crucially, she worked with Matt Hancock, helping him to write his Pandemic Diaries book. That's how she got her hands on all these messages. And you've been to speak to her in the bunker.
Talk us through the timeline of how you came into possession of all of these WhatsApp messages, because you did the book with Matt Hancock. So when did you first get hold of this stuff? And then talk me through your decision to decide to do more than just write the book with him, but do what you've done with the Telegraph.
So the book project was originally supposed to be 6 months. That is a pretty condensed time frame to write any books. I've written multiple books. 6 months is tough. In the event, it was extended to about a year, and it was only really about halfway through that process that I began getting these files. And frankly, I was astonished at what I was being given.
And when was this? A couple of years ago?
Oh no, we're talking about the summer.
Right.
You know.
So last summer, you're beginning to look at these files and think, oh my goodness.
Absolutely. And there are 2.3 million words worth of messages here, 100,000 or more individual messages and conversations. There was absolutely no way that I or Matt Hancock or anyone who works for him could possibly have gone through all of that. My role at that time was to help Matt Hancock write the book that he wanted, and it would have to be a true account. Of course, I'm not going to put my name to anything that I thought was false or misleading, but the best we could do within that time frame is draw from the critical messages that we could find easily. And I want to be fair to Matt Hancock, he did lean towards disclosure. That was his essential kind of bias, I think. So we were able to put an awful lot of this material in his book. But of course, there was an enormous amount left over. And it was only after the book was published, I discharged my responsibility to him, that I began thinking about whether there was in fact an overwhelming public interest in revealing more. Now, he had said publicly that he'd given all the material to the public inquiry. I've never asked him what that means. You know, did he give every bit of it, all 2.3 million words? But we now know that there is no prospect of anybody seeing any outcome from that anytime soon.
You say that he leant towards disclosure. Bluntly, when you were writing that book with him, were there things that you saw in these messages that he didn't want in that book?
Yes. I would challenge any journalist worth the name journalist who received a cache of information like this not to think, my goodness, this is extraordinary.
So you knew you'd struck gold whilst you were still writing the book, that you could write this book and then do all of this?
Actually, that wasn't the plan. It was an enormous challenge to get the book out. You know, that is a very detailed book and it has a lot of material from those WhatsApps in it. And, you know, it was exhausting doing it, frankly. To try to do that in parallel with earning a living was extremely tough. I loved it. I don't want to say poor me, but I certainly wasn't thinking about what came after. But you're right, you know, the journalistic instinct is to be thrilled. Of course it is. You know, I would challenge any of my colleagues in the industry who had received a cache of material like that to say, oh, well, you know, I'll use a bit of it and let's go with what we've chosen for the book and then I'll just kind of, you know, delete that. That is not what we're here to do as journalists.
And if that meant betraying Matt Hancock, that's fine.
Well, look, I take that seriously, of course I do, but ultimately the public interest was overwhelming and it isn't about Matt Hancock. You know, this is something so much bigger. This isn't about embarrassing individuals or making individual politicians look bad, nor is it, by the way, about me, although lots of people might like to make it so. It's so much bigger than that. It is about the entire country, and if we're going to talk about betrayal, then the way I'd see it is the betrayal of every one of us who were let down by the response to the pandemic. That's my responsibility, is to get information to them.
When did Matt Hancock find out about all this?
Well, Matt Hancock would have found out about this at the same time as everybody else found out about it when the Telegraph published the first exposé.
Why not give him a chance to offer a right to reply?
Well, the reality is that the paper felt that the most important thing was to get this out there. What we didn't want is any clever government shenanigans trying to block us from publishing, and that is always a real danger with a big exposé in which people are going to be somewhat embarrassed or at least made uncomfortable.
Lawyers intervening because there was a non-disclosure agreement?
No, actually there wasn't a non-disclosure agreement. There was a very standard terms of agreement between us, but it wasn't actually an NDA. But that's a boring technical point. It isn't actually what would have come into play here. As you know, governments can injunct newspapers from publishing things. I think the Telegraph would have had an extraordinarily powerful public interest argument, and I think...
But there was a risk there, you feared a risk there?
I think absolutely, of course. You know, that any big journalistic investigation into anyone always carries the risk of an injunction.
Do you ever worry that no one will ever trust you again?
No, I don't, because I'm really good at what I do. I do stories in the public interest and I make judgments. And, you know, already in the last 24 hours, I've had people coming to me with tip-offs and a lot of emails from members of the public saying, thank you.
What about the argument that it isn't really in the public interest because this is partial? These are WhatsApp exchanges. There's a million and one other bits of testimony out there that perhaps of course we don't even know about and we certainly haven't seen. And that the proper forum for an analysis of that is a public inquiry, not a drip, drip, drip in a newspaper over a couple of weeks.
Well, we've addressed that, haven't we, about the proper forum. Love the idea of a public inquiry. Let's do what Sweden did and wrap it up. They wrapped theirs up last year. So yes, in an ideal world, that is the proper forum. I've got no confidence in that. Is in no way a slight on the brilliant judge. She's an incredibly respected figure. She's been given the remit. She's not set it up to have no deadline. But you can't have confidence in a public inquiry that has no deadline and a remit that big. So as to the point about this being partial, the Telegraph coverage has been very upfront about that. We're not over-claiming for it. It is what it is. Where there are bits missing, we acknowledge that. And I would invite anybody who feels that they have other information that would put a different perspective on this, if they're sitting on a bunch of their own WhatsApps and say, hang on a minute, actually you needed this bit of the conversation, bring it on. I'd love to hear from you.
What about the criticism, we've heard it from Matt Hancock and others, that this is about pursuing an anti-lockdown agenda, that your worldview, if you like, on how the pandemic was handled is well known, perfectly respectable view in the range of the debate, but that's the principal motivation for you?
Who has a pro-lockdown agenda? I mean, what is that? Is that a thing? You know, what is a pro-lockdown agenda? I was very vocal during the pandemic, as were a small number of other brave people. I don't mean to put myself in the brave category, but it was difficult talking out at the time. It was difficult challenging the consensus. We know that eminent public health experts, epidemiologists, scientists were utterly vilified for expressing any dissenting view, for questioning what the government wanted to do. I think that was profoundly wrong. I think that absolutely I want to get to the heart of whether the repeated lockdowns were the right and proportionate response to the pandemic. We now know so much more about the collateral damage. That was obvious to me. It was obvious to a lot of public health experts and scientists. Only have to look, for example, in education, what we've covered in the Telegraph today. Over 100,000 children were lost to education forever because of the repeated lockdowns in schools. They dropped off school registers, they never returned. Now, better off children will of course bounce back. Kids are resilient. But it is a tragic truth that for some children, and probably quite a significant number, their life opportunities have been permanently damaged.
Let's talk finally about the process, the journalistic process of what we are now reading in the Daily Telegraph. We're at Telegraph Towers at the headquarters of the Daily and the Sunday Telegraph here. I've just been in the room known as the bunker down the corridor, a windowless room full of computers that aren't connected to the internet. I think that's right.
Yeah, that's right.
Where the cleaners haven't been in for 2 months and there's old takeaway forks on the floor and all the rest of it. Our audience will be interested in how this has been assembled journalistically. Talk us through that.
The process has been extraordinarily energy intensive, and the Telegraph put an enormous team onto this, and it's been very methodical. You know, when you're doing a project like this, what you don't want is 10 journalists all going off in different directions, you know, making notes in different formats and getting excited about different things but not telling each other. So the way this was managed has been utterly meticulous, extraordinarily professional. Very formulaic, you know, there's a huge volume of material to go through, so that had to be carved up between different WhatsApp groups. Some of them are very big groups. There's one WhatsApp group in particular that arrived in a dump of about 1 million words just in one group. That crashes most normal computers. So it had to be carved up in a certain way. But there were so many checks and balances built into the process. So each journalist involved was asked to check every other journalist's work, so that it was the case that everything could be coordinated. People could say, actually, I've spotted this, did you spot that? Because the Telegraph used their specialists in different areas.
So that's Isabel Oakeshott's view from Telegraph Towers. What about the views of some of the people who've been caught up in all of this?
Well, Matt Hancock in particular is very punchy in his response, as you might imagine, not least because of that sense of betrayal. And he says that it's outrageous and that she is pursuing an anti-lockdown agenda, as she puts it, and that it isn't in the public interest as he sees it, because the forum for that, he believes, is the public inquiry. But of course, we've heard her critique of that process, that sense from her that she thinks it's going to be too long-winded.
Now, today is World Book Day, as many parents will have experienced, and as I've seen many parents talking about on social media today. So we managed to rope in a real-life author to come and talk to us. It's former Children's Laureate and broadcaster Michael Rosen, who's here. Hello, Michael.
Hello. So I'm an author specimen for today. Yes, I like it.
Well, I mean, your latest book, Getting Better, does have quite a lot of medical stuff in it because there's a lot about your recovery from COVID. So specimen is almost
quite appropriate.
Quite an appropriate word, yeah.
Yes.
How are you feeling these days?
Very good. I'm very glad you're on my right-hand side because I can't really see with this eye.
Right.
And I can't really hear with that ear. That's right. With these cans on, it's fine. But they got knocked out with microbleeds in my brain as a consequence of COVID.
Blimey, because we've heard so much, haven't we, in the last few years about the classic symptoms and all the rest of it. But that as a lasting legacy of COVID is really quite something.
Yes. So to be technical about it, as we were going medical, so when or if the COVID virus gets into the bloodstream, then one of the cells that it attacks is the cells that prevent your blood from clotting. Yes, because you should only clot when you're exposed to oxygen. So if you attack those cells, you being the virus, well, then you start clotting. And so that's why in the very early stages, people were dying from heart attacks, strokes, embolisms, aneurysms, and so on. And then a sort of further down the line, these clots can go down into the capillaries. And so capillaries were bursting, and in my case, in my toes as well. So when I woke up after being in an induced coma for 40 days, I looked down at my toes and there was these kind of red blobs because I'd lost my toenails and lost the feeling in my toes as well.
Tell us about that moment of waking up.
Well, I've cheated actually because I don't really know anything about it because I didn't want to wake up. So I'd been in the coma for about 40 days and the medics were getting worried that I wouldn't wake up. And also my eyes were dilated, particularly this left eye, which sort of stays permanently dilated. And I think they were doing things like clicking their fingers and I wasn't reacting. And so they were getting very worried because someone who's been in a coma for that long, sometimes people don't wake up or wake up very damaged. And so Professor Hugh Montgomery, the consultant, had a great idea. He thought he'd bring my wife in, Emma. So this is during lockdown, of course, so they had to wheel me out of the intensive care ward onto the 4th floor atrium of the Whittington Hospital overlooking London. And Emma sat next to me. I know nothing about this. She held my hand and played recordings of my children, of our children and my older ones, in my ear. And apparently I waved my arm, I think, when one of them said, "Hi, Dad," or words to that effect, or "Wake up, Dad. You've been asleep for a long time, Dad," that sort of thing. And I waved my arm. And according to Hugh, that when they wheeled me back into the lift, I didn't stop talking. So there's a surprise. You're getting a flavour of not stopping talking right now.
What were you saying?
I'm not sure. Hugh hasn't told me, but he has said that they were worried that I was brain dead. That was the way he put it. Doctors do quite like sort of nailing it, don't they? He said, "We were worried you were brain dead." And I said to him, "Well, why didn't you tell me at the time?" And he said, "Well, because we thought you were brain dead." Anyway.
When you were conscious again, and conscious that you were conscious, if you see what I mean, was there a feeling of elation? Were you frightened?
Well, to tell you the truth, I had no idea what had happened to me because either Emma or doctors or nurses told me I'd been in intensive care. And excuse my ignorance, but at the time I thought that meant that was somewhere where they cared for me intensively. I didn't know it was this place where they, where you sit there and the chances are they've filled you full of, as in their terms, drugs to knock you out and drugs to paralyse you. And in my case, also intubated with a tube down my throat. I just thought I'd been looked after rather well, and I didn't know that time had passed. So I'm not blaming anybody, but it wasn't actually made clear to me. And it was only really, I think, about 2 or 3 months later that I fully realised that, because my last memory is of a doctor saying, "Will you please sign this piece of paper to put you to sleep?" And I said, "Will I wake up?" And he said, "You've got a 50-50 chance." And I said, "And if I don't sign?" And he said, 0. So I thought, well, I'll probably sign then.
Yeah.
And at the time, I don't know whether I was already high on something that they were giving me, but I remember thinking, 50-50, not so bad. But then I did also have a sort of much sadder thing in my mind that flashed. It was that my son Eddie died of meningococcal septicemia. And that means that the meningitis bacterium invades your body. And I remember talking to a doctor about it, and I was concerned that he knew that he was ill, or that he knew that he was dying, or that he was in pain. So I said this to the doctor, and he said, no, he was asleep, and also that the effect of that bacterium in the body meant that he didn't know, and he just went into unconsciousness, and he then added, and all his body turned to mush inside because it erodes the membranes around every cell. And I actually remember a sort of flash at that very moment when he said that, 50-50, and will I wake up? Well, you may or may not. And I thought, well, if I don't wake up, well, it won't matter much because I won't know about it. And that will be like Eddie. And in that split second, I thought that.
How's it changed your outlook on life? Given that this toss of a coin, 50-50 chance, and it worked, it happened, you survived, you're here. Does over time, is there a reversion to how things were and reveling in how things were? Or are you different in how you approach day-to-day life?
I think I always believed in seize the day, seize the time. I think I did always believe in that. My very clever daughter told me that I'm an optimistic nihilist. And I said, oh, right, am I? And she said, yes, you're a nihilist because you don't believe in a deity and you don't believe in the afterlife, and you're optimistic. You believe that you take every day and make of it what you can. Well, I was like that before I got ill, and I guess I'm now sort of super seize the day, whatever that would be in Latin. Carpe super diem. That would mean over the top. But anyway, which is, of course, as well, it is a bit OTT. But anyway, yes. Yes, I'd say that I believe very much that, make every day a good day.
Does it make you sort of think, gosh, if I can survive these moments, I can survive anything? Or does it make you aware of your vulnerability?
Yeah, I don't think I'm Superman, so it's the other. Yes, I am very aware of my vulnerability. Of course, I knew a vulnerability, if only through Eddie. The fact that I put him to bed and went in the morning and said, Eddie, I'm just going off to work now, and he was dead. So you can't get a more acute sense of vulnerability than that. So I was fully aware of that, but of course, it's slightly different when it's you.
A big part of your life has been going into schools and doing readings and meeting your readers. Have you noticed a difference in schools now after the pandemic and all those lockdowns? Or maybe it's a bit hard to tell if you're there as a kind of special guest.
Yes, I don't think I've noticed it in the children. They are quite intrigued when I do actually tell them some of it. I mean, not all the gory details, but I do tell them about how I was asleep for 40 days and 40 nights. And do they know of any other stories of 40 days and 40 nights? And sometimes we get Jesus, and I assure them I'm not Jesus. And then we do get to Noah. And then I say that I didn't have an ark, but I did have a bed. And I wasn't allowed to go there with my wife. We have a little speculation as to what Noah's wife was called. And there were no animals. And we sing the animals went in 2 by 2. And then I tell them about how Emma came in and woke me up. I tell them that. And also about how they taught me how to walk. Because I think that's quite an interesting thing for children. They're looking at a bloke who's seeming to walk and so on, that I couldn't. So I tell them that. And it's funny that I do sense a sort of, I don't know, it's almost as if there's a kind of pall over the audience while I tell that story. And they may know, of course, grandparents, uncles, aunties, parents, whatever, died during the pandemic or got very, very ill and they were worried. So I am telling it because it happened to me, but also, I mean, what is the function of storytelling? We're asking this on World Book Day because one of the functions of storytelling is you're giving a space to people listening to compare themselves, to say, did that happen to me? Or is there anything like something? No, it's nothing like, or, oh, I wish that happened to me, or, oh, I hope that never happens to me. That's what storytelling gives you, that space. Yeah. And so that's why I tell the story.
Do you think there will be long-term effects, though, on that generation of children from what they went through? That pall that you feel in the school hall when you're chatting to them about this, do you think that pall will exist kind of over their entire education?
I think maybe the youngest ones might forget it. I don't know, or it may just seem rather odd. But I think there's probably those middle teens. I think they might be quite. It might for some of them may be quite disturbing. I'm guessing.
Now, children's books have been in the news in a big way in the last few weeks because of the controversy around Roald Dahl's back catalogue and the version of the books that was going to be on the shelves, which took out harmful words like fat and horrible and evil and things like that.
Ugly.
Yeah. Except then the publishers decided there's now going to be a compromise and there'll be the kind of new versions with those words taken out, but you'll still be able to buy the classic ones with some of the words still in.
Or did they decide, or was that the plan, or right from the start? I've
plan?
no idea. Don't ask me. I'm not that side of the business.
I just wonder what your hunch is on words like fat and ugly and mad. Should they have a place in children's books in 2023? Because they're very punchy words. They're instantly understood words, but they're also words that some don't like.
I'm not going to be a commissar on this myself. I'll be a commissar on me and say that I'll avoid them. Right, I would avoid mad because people have said to me, mad is very pejorative. It connects with mental illness. If you say you're mad, and of course we do say it in speech, you must be mad to say that.
And we don't really mean anything to do with mental illness.
No, but if you put it in a book, it sort of fossilises it in a way. And if you say this mad woman came in, if you say she went mad, maybe that's not quite so bad. But if you say there was a woman or a man who's mad or a child who's mad, and you think that's also being used in the playground against people, you might just hesitate to put it. So there's a lot of self-censorship goes on when we write books. And, again, if you say somebody's ugly, which was one of the words they took out, well, what does that mean? We know beauty is in the eye of the beholder. There is no objective no objective thing called ugliness. And with these days, we do tend to believe that, no matter what people look like, they can be beautiful on the inside, all these things. And so you think about these things when you write, and, we make mistakes. I mean, there are books of mine you can find from the past, and somebody could say, well, why did you do that? And I'll say, well, let's change it then.
Are they going through your back catalogue?
I don't think so. I mean, there have been re-editions of things where we have changed odd bits and pieces. I think I had one, you'll like this, I had a poem about jumping up and down on drain covers. And the word I used for that when I was a kid was bonking. Right. Bonking on the drains. And so we agreed
you might get arrested for that
probably
days,
we'd take that one out.
Right,
so in fact, the poem, lovely poem, I really like it. We're bonking on the drains. It's not in the latest edition of that book.
What's the new word?
No, the whole poem came out.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Michael, what are you reading on this World Book Day?
I am reading a wonderful book called I'm Black So You Don't Need to Be. And it's by a former colleague of mine and of yours, Colin Grant, who was the son of two Jamaicans, and he's writing about his family. And it is a beautiful, wonderful book, and he's used a wonderful device. Each person in his family has a separate chapter, so you see the world through the eyes of that person in his family. Great book.
Chris?
The Power of Geography by Tim Marshall.
Oh, very on brand.
Former Sky News diplomatic editor, I think he was, wasn't he? Foreign affairs editor. The thing is, though, I must admit, doing this job, I can see how I think Laura Kay quite liked a bit of trashy literature at the end of long days, because I love Tim Marshall, but it's a bit heavy going after a 17-hour day.
And is geography powerful?
I think it is. Well, Adam and I are both
geographers.
Geography
Oh, well,
students,
yes.
so,
well, my brother's a geologist,
extent.
paleontologist, so he knows where things are as well. So, yes, it's in your...
Mine is super on brand because I'm reading an introduction to political philosophy for students and politicians for a little project I'm working on.
That makes
my... You're going to write one yourself?
Potentially, yeah. Stay tuned.
Makes the power of geography seem like light reading.
Michael, thank you very much for coming in.
Well, thanks for having me.
And thank you to you too for watching and listening and being part of this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.
Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.